At a time when the Arab peoples affirm their quest for democracy in what is called now the Arab Spring, the time has come also for the Palestinian Spring, the time for independence.
Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas at the United Nations General Assembly today calling for an independent Palestinian state. Of course, he's making the push for this to happen through a unilateral declaration of the UN as opposed to peace negotiations like the ones called for in the '93 Oslo Accord that Abbas himself signed. Lots going on in New York this week. That includes a conference that Immigration Minister Jason Kenney was at. We're going to talk about that shortly, but first, Minister Kenney, thanks for coming in.
Good to be here, Brian. Thank you.
I know you're the Immigration Minister, you're not the Foreign Affairs Minister, but you have a fair understanding of what the Canadian government's position is on this bid for Palestinian statehood.
Well, very simply, we support a two-state solution that is negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians, and this is an effort to circumvent or short-circuit that negotiated approach. Our concern is that it will simply create unrealistic expectations. It will inflame passions and emotions. And ultimately, there isn't a Palestinian state. And so it will just derail any prospect for peace through a negotiated settlement. So our preference is that both parties sit down in good faith and discuss a final status solution that leads to a secure Israel next to a viable Palestinian state.
I mean, the Canadian government has, and for a long time supported a two-state solution. It's
Right.
not as critics of your government say, you don't want Palestinian state at all.
No.
That's always been the case.
The
right?
real problem, Brian, is that a lot of the actors in the region support a one-state solution. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria support a one-state solution that does not include a state for the Jewish people.
And doesn't include rights for them.
Yeah.
Israel's Prime Minister was up speaking today. He, of course, opposes this, Benjamin Netanyahu. He also made some comments about the United Nations that might echo some of what you said. Let's hear from Netanyahu.
Here's what's happening now, right now, today. Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon now presides over the UN Security Council. This means, in effect, that a terror organization presides over the body entrusted with guaranteeing the world's security. You couldn't make this thing up.
He had a lot of critiques for the United Nations, and you did as well when you were at this conference in Durban. Do Canadians still...
About Durban.
About Durban, yeah. Durban 3, it's called. It wasn't in Durban. Durban's in South Africa. It's called Durban 3. But it was in a posh New York hotel, from what I understand. Do Canadians have rose-colored glasses on when they consider the UN?
I think
the UN does some good. I'm not going to ask you to drop all over them.
Look, I think obviously there are some aspects of the UN that are very useful, very important. As John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, said yesterday at the same conference, a lot of the social service agencies of the UN do good work, and it is important to have some forum where different countries can come around the table. The problem is that some of the world's worst human rights abusers, totalitarian states that execute homosexuals, that persecute people based on their ethnicity or religion, that have concentration camps like North Korea, are given the same status and often preferential status. The case I raised yesterday was that the conference on human rights and combating racism, Durban 2, was chaired by Muammar Gaddafi's Libyan regime, one of the worst, and the vice chair was Iran, and one of the other vice chairs was Castro's Cuba. This is, as to quote Netanyahu, you could hardly make this up.
Well, let's play a couple of clips from your speech yesterday in New York, and then we'll break it down a bit.
The UN human rights chief was shocked and disappointed by the absence at Durban 2 of several free, pluralistic countries with the world's strongest protections for civil and human rights, countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. And yet she did not express one syllable of dismay that the conference itself was organized by some of the world's most notorious human rights violators, with Gaddafi's Libya in the chair, ably assisted by Ahmadinejad's Iran as vice chair, with Castro's Cuba pitching in as rapporteur.
Some of what you had said earlier, but I mean, the chair of UN Human Rights worried that you weren't showing up?
It's bizarre. There's this woman named Navi Pillay. She's ironically from Durban, South Africa herself. She is the Human Rights High Commissioner for, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she's the one who keeps sponsoring these celebrations of the Durban Hate Fest, which occurred 10 years ago in South Africa, a UN process that was supposed to bring the world together to combat racism, bigotry, and xenophobia. Yeah. But in fact, it turned into a circus of hatred, as it's been described, against Israel, and with very clear anti-Semitic overtones. There were approved NGOs at that forum that were selling copies of the anti-Semitic tract, the Chronicles of the Elders of Zion. There were spontaneous protests with Nazi imagery approvingly displayed. There was the renewal of the Zionism as racism canard. Only one form of nationalism is racism, and that's Jewish nationalism. All of this infected the process, and yet this person, Navi Pillay, keeps bringing it back. She did for Durban 2 in Geneva 3 years ago, now Durban 3 in New York, and all you get are all these people coming to five-star hotels to slag the United States and its Western allies, including Israel.
Yeah, okay, we've got one more clip from your speech yesterday. Let's roll that.
It's an old refrain. If anyone, anywhere is suffering, it's the liberal democratic West that is to blame. And it's sung enthusiastically by many Western NGOs whose capacity for self-guilt is exceeded only by their gullibility. Why do they delude themselves into believing that blank checks can substitute for freedom, civil society, and the rule of law? Or that in the long term, foreign aid can benefit societies that lack these fundamental building blocks?
So I want to ask you, you've critiqued the NGOs that are at these things, you've critiqued the NGOs that follow the UN. How do we reform this? You admit, John Bolton admits, and he's the guy that says knock off, I think, the top 10 floors and nobody would notice a difference. He says that there's some good the UN does, but how do you deal with the human rights rapporteur, North Korea being the chair of the conference on reducing disarmament? Yeah, your colleague John Baird blew a gasket when that happened, and rightly so. How do you deal with that?
Well, what I said in my speech and what we've been doing as a government is to withdraw from those processes that become irredeemably tainted when those bizarre situations happen. We obviously, Canada will try to continue to play a constructive role at the UN, but so often we are outvoted so massively, I think we should realize in those situations that we're just not going to participate. I'll give you an example. When we were for 3 years on the UN Human Rights Council, we were frequently outvoted by a margin of like 42-1 on all of these one-sided anti-Israel motions, amongst other things. And so, you know, I think what we've learned to do is to say we're not going to lend the good name of Canada to the Disarmament Commission as long as North Korea's in the chair, or the Durban process when it's tainted by this kind of hatred. And so I think we'll be more selective. I think that's the general approach we've taken. We will not participate in those aspects of multilateral organizations like the UN that are just so tainted like that.
I have to say, and it's a credit to the Government of Canada that we have been leading for a long time on these things, and I know that colleague and opponent Erwin Kotler from the Liberal Party was at the first Durban one, tried to turn it around, and when couldn't, they pulled out.
Well, he did, but the government, the Liberal government, unfortunately stayed to the bitter end, represented by Hedy Fry, then Minister for Multiculturalism.
Okay, so I knew Kotler had pulled out. So the other one is standing up and walking out on Ahmadinejad. I'm sorry, I don't even give him the respect of saying his name properly. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, gets up, says his crazy things. I think Canada's been leading on that, and dozens and dozens of delegates and diplomats stood up and walked out on him yesterday.
Under the Harper government, Canada was the first country in the world to announce its withdrawal from the tainted Durban 2 process back in 2003, and again this year, the Durban 3 process. We have been the lead sponsor of the UN motion criticizing Iran's atrocious human rights record. You're right, we've led the boycotts when Ahmadinejad is there. We're I think the only country to pull out of the Disarmament Commission with North Korea in the chair. Yeah. We're setting a standard, and you know what? This country has a lot of moral authority, as a champion of human rights and pluralism, and we should use it. We ought not let that reputation be tainted when some of the worst human rights violators in the world walk into the room.
All right, don't know that many across the country could disagree with you. Jason Kenney, Minister of Immigration, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much, Brian.